Sure. So I am a computational biologist and genomicist, and so we work on various problems in evolution. Mostly, I have been interested for the last 20 years in evolution of dynamical systems. And what I mean by dynamical systems is something sort of broad. So all organisms have various systems dynamics, like development or regulation of genes, and all the mechanical things that work in a, say, organism. And we work on all different levels of those kind of questions. That's a very good question. And of course, these days, modern biology and biomedical sciences is impossible to do without having engineering involved. So I can give you a good example from DNA sequencing. So when I was about 30 years ago doing undergraduate research, we were able to sequence DNA about maybe 1 letter, 2 letters per day. These days, we can sequence DNA about 30 billion letters per day. And the reason is that, we used to do these things in test tubes, maybe about this big, right? And now, the engineering has miniaturized this chemical process to the extent that on this much of space, we now have devices that can carry out 3 billion reactions in time. So that's one thing. So all of everything, of course, relies on engineering techniques or technology development. Also, on the other hand, so we get, say, 3 billion letters of information in 10 days from a single machine. There's about 10 such machines on campus right now. So you can imagine, this is the kind of information that nobody can read or look at or think about, right? So there's no doubt that we have to use things like computation and analytical tools to understand this information. So that's one level. So engineering always provides us technologies to do things better. On the other hand, of course, there's other kind of connections. One of the things that I work on is probability models for DNA evolution. It turns out some of the things that we use there, like algebraic geometry techniques, are the same kind of techniques that robotic engineers use to, say, control robots. Right? So we have kind of this kind of theoretical commonalities. And in the sort of the big picture, engineering sort of deals with the idea of developing function under the constraints of physics and chemistry. Okay? And organismal evolution is the same. That's what nature does, optimizes function under these physical and chemical constraints. I can give you a very good example. I had a former colleague at Yale, Ron Breaker, who was engineering new kinds of RNA molecules. And these are RNA molecules that carry out certain chemical reactions. And so they developed this very interesting molecule, and then they thought, this is such an interesting function that it must exist in nature. So then they went out looking for RNA molecules that had this function, and they did indeed find this in certain microbes. And this became a big splash and became a very important piece of work. So in that sense, we learn from engineering what's possible and we can look for in nature as a part of sort of the big broad picture of helping us understand the organization of nature. Oh, absolutely. So I have many colleagues. I'm in the Arts and Sciences School, and I work with many colleagues in engineering. I have a joint appointment in computer science. So I work with at least half a dozen people in the computer science department, in robotics, as I mentioned before, as well as chemical engineering. And of course, it was the medical school. I have dozens of colleagues that I work with closely. Of course, there's lots of trivial things that impede research, but I think the biggest challenge is vertical integration in research. So what I mean by that is that there's some problem that I might be working on. Actually, we're working on some problems that relate to evolution of neurons, of brain cells. And it might be from that research, I feel like there's some interesting engineering approach that we can use to get better data. And then also what the process we're working on might actually have translational applications for, let's say, certain human diseases like schizophrenia and such. Now, of course, I work on a small piece, but really what you want is a vertically integrated research program that says we bring all the engineering resources and techniques to bear, and do the basic research, and also try to develop the applications in terms of trying to help human diseases and so. And that takes a lot of organization, lots of teamwork, and also people willing to work across many, across different disciplines, and in this integrated manner from all the way from basic sciences, technology development, to applications to human diseases. And organizing that is very difficult. It's also somewhat difficult in academia, in US academia especially, because we are not, the schools are not structured very well for this kind of large teamwork. And at Penn, actually, we do it better than most places. Part of that is, we're a very compact campus, everybody works well with each other, but that's not really true overall. And part of that also is the reward system. So in European science, for example, they have large structures like institutes and structures that promote large teamwork. Here, we do tend to reward the individual more than the team. And yes, and grants and promotions and so on. And so that is a bit of a barrier. And so that's a cultural barrier that we all need to work to overcome. Sure. So, and this is actually came from a collaboration. So I collaborate with my colleague Jim Everwine, who's a molecular neuroscientist, who's in the pharmacology department at School of Medicine. And we were working on this problem of RNAs in neurons. And so RNA is copies of the DNA, and they come in multiplicities. And in fact, you can sort of think of RNA, what we call the transcriptome. That's the suite of all the RNAs that's in a cell. And so you might have 5 of this molecule, 10 of that molecule, and 100 of that another molecule. Those are all, so it's kind of the first elaboration of the program that's in the genome, so into these different numbers of molecules. And so we're studying how these molecules find where to go in the cell, because a cell is not a soup. It's actually highly structured. Better analogy is like a building, that there's many places these molecules go. And so very surprisingly, we found one kind of signal that's in these RNA, and that signal happens to actually be a copy from what used to be an ancient viral origin element called retroviral element. So that sort of on one hand is very evolutionary, very interesting. So you have co-option of what used to be considered parasitic sequences into becoming functional. On the other hand, it also gives us some hints as to why certain kinds of, say, mental diseases might be susceptible to things that may impact these kind of retroviral pathways in the cell. So we're now starting to think about some of these kind of things. So the most surprising thing is this evolutionary co-option of viral element, and then the other is the surprising finding. This may give us a hint into the mechanisms by which things like neuropsychiatric diseases might manifest.
And to do that, did you use a sort of database, or how did you?
This is all based on both, being able to do very detailed molecular work. So it involves things like micro-dissecting neurons, and then being able to amplify tiny amounts of RNA and being able to know what RNA is in the neuron. And then based on that information, doing computational analysis to find things like what I was saying about these signals. So these are, we call them zip codes. So there are zip codes in each RNA that tell them where to go. And in order to know what the zip code is, you have to do a lot of computational analysis to look for, say, motifs and such. So there's a field in the sense of computational biology and genomics, and this has been going on for the last 20 years, and it's only getting faster, better, bigger. Yeah. So it's very exciting. There's no doubt that genomics is impacting everything biomedical sciences, especially in clinical practice, which we think will come within the next 3-4 years. That just like you may go in and have an MRI, you may go in and have a genome scan to try to discover risk factors or therapeutic strategies. That's one side. On the evolution side, so evolutionary biology it used to be about trying to describe the generating process of this diversity of nature, all the organisms, right? And you have lots of theories and interesting observations there. It used to be that it was hard to translate this into mechanisms, and especially understanding things like human diseases, mostly because the data was hard to get. Now with things like genomic technologies, data is so much easier to get that what's becoming a bottleneck now is, well, I'm trying to study this particular, say, neurons in cells. What we want to know is, how does this work in all the different organisms, right? Because when we do that comparison, then we have much better understanding of the process in the, say, human cells that we might be interested in. So evolution obviously plays a fundamental role in as a theoretical basis for understanding biology, but it's also becoming much more important in being able to provide contrasting case examples in which we can understand even detailed processes for particular organisms like human. Well, so first, it's important to have skills. And I know that sounds very pat, and many students, of course, are very skilled, but I mean a unique skill. Like maybe you're very good at programming, or maybe you know how to fabricate microfluidic devices, right? Or maybe you know how to do molecular biology. Because, I talked about teamwork before. When you have a team, well, you can't be a generalist. Well, of course, we need general perspective, but you also need to bring a skill to the table, right? And if you have that skill to the table, then there's always place for you at the table. The second, of course, is you need to get involved early. Undergraduate is a wonderful opportunity to do research. I've had undergraduates in the lab who publish first author papers and so on, but it takes a long time. So you can't just at your senior year decide you're going to do research. Well, of course you have an experience, but you won't be able to do something very meaningful. So get involved early, and to get involved early, you should interact with your professors. And professors are always willing to talk to students, and if somebody shows a strong interest and has skills, I and everybody else is happy to get them involved in research. So you need to reach out, be very proactive about it. And lastly, real research requires a lot of discipline. There's long periods of boredom in which nothing happens, and then bang, something interesting happens, right? So if you're the type sort of like, something doesn't happen for a week, and then you lose interest, and you start wanting to do other extracurricular activities, well, it becomes hard. So you have to have some discipline.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. I think that was perfect for what we needed.
Great.